Welcome back to Choppin_Game_209. Hope you enjoy. Stockton in 1950 was the farthest inland port in California, a surprising fact for a city miles from the sea and oceans. The Deepwater Channel was completed in 1933, but the 1950s saw rapid port growth, making Stockton a key inland shipping hub. Farmland stretched all around it, rich and fertile frontier. It was a place where rivers met, the San Joaquin and the Calaveras, their waters carving paths through the valley. People came to Stockton looking for work, for a new start, for something different from what they had known before. The city felt like it was on the edge of something new, full of quiet promise and the scent of agriculture. But the old Stockton ways of life still held on tight in many quarters, a stubborn resistance to the inevitable, that Stockton sun. It burned hot in those long San Joaquin Valley summers, and that Tule fog. It rolled in extra thick and cold during those Stockton winter months, covering the landscape like a blanket for miles. Life here was not always easy for everyone who arrived, testing their resolve daily and took some getting used to. Change was coming fast, first as a whisper, then as a steady, undeniable current. The second great migration of African American families moved from the southern states in growing numbers during these years. They sought a life free from the harsh grip of Jim Crow laws and segregation and racism. They heard that California was a promised land, a place of opportunity and perhaps greater freedom. Between 1940 and 1960, the African American population in Stockton grew significantly, reflecting a statewide trend. By 1960, it is estimated that around 15,000 African American people called Stockton their home, a substantial increase from the previous decade. They traveled by train, by bus, by car over long and tiring miles. Each journey was an act of profound hope, a gamble on an uncertain future and aspirations. They left behind everything they knew, family, friends, familiar landscapes for a chance at something better, something more. The new arrivals found a city of sharp contrasts and unspoken rules. There was work to be found, especially in the fields during harvest season and in the bustling canneries. Some found jobs at the port, loading and unloading cargo, or at the military depots that dotted the area. But good housing was often segregated, confined to specific neighborhoods with limited options. The Boggs Tract neighborhood, Southside Stockton and Eastside Stockton, became home to many African American and Mexican American families due to redlining and racial covenants that excluded them from North Stockton. Schools and housing remained segregated undeterred. They built their own churches, brick by brick, song by song. South Stockton and East Stockton grew rapidly, creating strong black and brown communities centered around churches and civic groups. They started small businesses, grocery stores, cafes, barbershops. They created spaces where they could feel welcome, where their culture could breathe. Their children enrolled in new schools, facing both opportunities and new forms of prejudice. The great wars of the earlier 20th century had already profoundly shaped Stockton. During World War I, the city and its surrounding agricultural lands supported the nation's efforts. Stockton's rich delta soil and access to irrigation made it a major producer of crops like asparagus, wheat, barley, and alfalfa, used for flour, feed, and food supplies. These crops helped feed American soldiers and were also shipped overseas to support Allied nations, especially Britain and France. Stockton fed soldiers overseas and families at home. World War II brought even bigger, more lasting changes to the city's fabric. The Port of Stockton became a vital hub for wartime logistics. Ships were built and repaired there, a hive of activity day and night. Military supply depots, most notably the Naval Supply Annex, expanded rapidly. These bases brought an influx of people and government money. They also starkly showed Stockton its direct link to the wider world, a world often engulfed in conflict and turmoil, influencing its future path. African American culture began to bloom vibrantly in Stockton, taking root in the soil of a new place. The South Side and parts of the East Side became lively centers of this emerging community. Churches were far more than just places of Sunday worship. They were essential community anchors, serving as meeting halls, social centers, and sources of unwavering strength and guidance. Barbershops and beauty salons buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the sharing of news from back home in the new city. Small restaurants opened serving familiar foods, greens, cornbread, smothered chicken aromas that brought comfort and connection. Music filled the air on weekends and evenings, the soulful sounds of gospel, the heartfelt blues, and the improvisational rhythms of jazz, birthing homegrown musicians, echoing resilience and joy. At the same time, many Latin American families had already made their way to Stockton. A significant number arrived from Mexico, while others journeyed from various parts of Central and South America. They were drawn by the prospect of work, often in the vast, fertile agricultural fields of the San Joaquin Valley that demanded strenuous labor. The Bracero program, a guest worker initiative, had brought many men to the region in earlier decades. Some of these men decided to stay, to put down roots, and to bring their families to join them. They too came seeking a better life, an escape from economic hardship or social instability in their homelands. Their journey was frequently arduous, marked by uncertainty, but fueled by a powerful determination to succeed. These newest arrivals from Latin America often settled in neighborhoods like Little Manila and the West End. Sometimes they lived alongside other migrant groups, creating a diverse, if sometimes crowded, mosaic. They started their own small stores known as tiendas, selling food, spices, and goods that reminded them of their homelands. The melodic sounds of Spanish voices increasingly joined the city's diverse chorus of languages. They celebrated their cherished traditions, their vibrant holidays like Cinco de Mayo and Dia de Muertos, and their deeply held faith. They too faced discrimination in housing and employment, and the daily difficulties of adapting to a new culture. But they worked hard, contributing significantly to Stockton's agricultural economy and its growing cultural diversity. The military presence in and around Stockton remained strong and in some ways continued to grow. While the Stockton Army Airfield had closed its gates after World War II, other key military facilities continued their operations. The Naval Supply Annex, in particular, was a major employer in the region, providing thousands of civilian jobs. Nearby, Sharp Army Depot and Tracy Defense Depot also contributed to the local economy and the city's strategic importance. These bases provided steady, relatively well-paying jobs for many residents, including a number of the new arrivals. Military families frequently moved in and out Stockton, creating a frequently relocating population. This constant flow connected Stockton to national defense priorities and international events, bringing different people and perspectives together to add to the multinational cultures in Stockton. Anyone remember the Stockton State Hospital? Originally, it was established as the Stockton State Insane Asylum, stood as a large, somewhat forbidding presence on the city's landscape. It was one of the oldest and largest mental institutions in California, housing thousands of patients. During and after World War II, many soldiers returned with psychological trauma. Stockton State Hospital became one of the facilities where veterans suffering from combat fatigue or shell shock were admitted. During these post-war decades, concerns about conditions within such large state hospitals began to grow across the nation. Between the 1940s and 1950s, Stockton State Hospital, like others around the country, used lobotomies, electroconvulsive therapy, and sedative drugs like Thorazine on patients deemed uncontrollable. Reports from various sources frequently spoke of issues like severe overcrowding, chronic understaffing, and the challenges of providing adequate care with limited resources for the patients. Between 1950 to 1960, Stockton State Hospital was severely overcrowded. Many families in Stockton had loved ones at the hospital but rarely spoke about them. The stigma of mental illness led to generational silence. The line between mental illness and social deviance was often blurred. Some people were institutionalized for reasons like alcoholism, poverty, homelessness, and unwed pregnancy. They were institutionalized indefinitely without due process. Patients were put to work on the hospital's vast grounds, which included farm fields, orchards and dairies, kitchen work, sewing, maintenance, and laundry. This was justified as therapeutic, but the labor saved the state significant money, and patients were rarely compensated. Some former patients were released, while others never left and died there, buried in unmarked graves. Some were forgotten by their families after being committed in their youth or as children. Now let's talk about the civil and housing rights movement in Stockton. Downtown Stockton was being gutted by urban renewal projects starting in the late 1960s. Freeways, new civic buildings, and rezoning displaced mostly Black Filipino and brown communities. Economic opportunities, while present, were not always shared equally among all residents. Filipino and Mexican workers led farm labor strikes, standing shoulder to shoulder with Cesar Chavez and the UFW to demand dignity and fair pay. The powerful civil rights movements and the protest against the Vietnam War was sweeping across the country, inspired local activism and calls for justice. But they also highlighted the deep and persistent divisions within the city of Stockton. Black and brown families in Stockton were blocked from buying homes in white neighborhoods, kept out through redlining and discrimination. Frustration grew steadily over issues like discriminatory housing practices, limited access to good jobs, and perceived inequities in policing practices. Activists pushed for fair housing laws, demanding the right to live where they could afford, not where racism allowed. Redlining meant Black and brown and Filipino families were boxed into South and East Stockton, unable to build wealth through homeownership, leading to intergenerational poverty. But while we marched in the streets, the system was rewriting the map. Red lines boxed us in, bulldozers tore down homes, churches, memories, calling it progress. They called it urban renewal. We called it what it was, displacement. Some Stockton residents protested police brutality, demanding transparency and protection, not profiling. The city was undeniably changing, but not everyone felt they were benefiting from these transformations, creating unrest. While marches were happening in the south part of the U.S., a quieter struggle was unfolding in Stockton, California. Black and Latino youth began organizing, sometimes as protection groups, other times as militant political activists. Early civil rights protests gained steam fast nationally. Desegregation and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 made a younger generation in Stockton leaned more into Black empowerment and self-determination. Local chapters of the Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam and other grassroots organizations emerged in cities like Oakland and Sacramento. Stockton youth were influenced by this wave. By the early 1970s, factories, agriculture jobs, and shipyard work started drying up or moving overseas. Youth unemployment spiked, especially among Black and Mexican American teens. Idle time plus no opportunity equaled growing frustration and disconnection from mainstream society. Jobs vanished and doors closed. Shipyards, fields, rail yards, once the lifeblood of Stockton, started shutting down or locking them out. Young men with no work, no future, no options were left in the streets with nothing but time. Local youth groups started to form in response, some primarily for self-protection, others for a sense of identity and belonging. The next generation wasn't asking for rights, they were demanding power. In East and South Stockton, the vibe shifted from peace to pressure. Black power, Chicano pride, self-defense, self-respect. The early ominous signs of what would later become a much larger and more serious problem started to appear on the city's streets, in its parks, and within its schools. But in the shadows of that pride, something darker crept in. Heroin, cocaine, weed, and the hustlers and the guns. The underground economy became survival, and the streets start making its own rules, and when police showed up, it wasn't to protect, it was to patrol, to punish, to provoke. Trust was gone, respect was gone, something new was rising, and it wasn't hope. This was the decade Stockton boiled. A generation raised in broken homes, broken schools, and broken promises. Before the Crips, before the Bloods, before the Norteños and the war on the streets, there was this. They thought the civil rights era would change everything. Instead, it cracked the surface, and what came next was fire. Then, the Vietnam veterans came home. They left as boys but returned as ghosts of themselves. No parades, no heroes welcome, just silence, protest, and pain. Some soldiers came back with addictions. Thousands ended up homeless, forgotten on the same streets they once swore to protect. Veterans came home with a soldier's honor, trained to be battle-tested, just to come back and find disrespect. They demanded recognition. They changed how America saw mental health and forced the government to say three powerful words: we were wrong. When heroes came home broken and forgotten, the next generation watched, and in the silence, in the struggle, in the streets, they found brotherhood in the only place that welcomed them. Not in parades, but in the gangs. Violence in Stockton did increase, becoming a more visible and troubling feature of life during these years. By 1975, Stockton had changed, the movement had faded, the economy had dried up, and the streets, they started whispering new names. From Southern Cali, word began to travel. So did people. Cousins, uncles, homies, some running from war, others bringing it with them. South Central, Watts, Compton, names we'd only heard in songs or stories, now had cousins in Stockton. They didn't come wearing colors, not yet, but they came with stories, with codes, with a way of life that was about survival at all costs. And Stockton youth, already left behind, already searching for identity, listened, learned, and some followed. A chronic lack of meaningful opportunities for young people, the insidious early stages of the drug trade starting to take hold, and the growing presence and territoriality of more organized youth groups. By 1976, the air had changed. Something was coming, not just violence, but an identity, a culture, a code. The sense of community that once felt strong and supportive began to show visible cracks under the relentless strain of fear and growing mistrust. Stockton wasn't just watching LA anymore, they were becoming it. Towards the very end of this quarter century, around the early to mid-1970s, the first faint signs of the Crips and Bloods began to appear in Stockton. These now infamous street gangs were originally born on the troubled streets of South Central Los Angeles in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Their influence and membership started to spread beyond Los Angeles as people moved between cities for various reasons: family relocation, attempts to escape violence, or intentional expansion of gang activities. Memberships to these Los Angeles-based groups began to emerge in Stockton. This was not yet a full-blown invasion or a deeply entrenched presence. Rather, it represented the early seeding of a gang culture that would later have a profound, widespread, and often devastating impact on the city for many years to come. The names Crips, Bloods, and Norteño started to be whispered in certain circles. Stockton's underground was a complex tapestry woven from many disparate threads, existing just below the surface of official city life. It included the fervent hopes and quiet dreams of countless migrants who had journeyed from the American South and Latin America, all seeking new lives and opportunities. It also held the deep-seated frustrations and quiet desperation of those who felt left behind or marginalized by the city's changing economy and social structures. It was the dynamic space where new cultures met, interacted, sometimes blended and sometimes clashed. Underground economies operating outside formal regulations provided livelihoods for some, a way to survive when other doors were closed. It was also, unfortunately, where the seeds of organized crime and more structured gang activity found fertile ground to germinate and grow, fed by social and economic disparities. This hidden world was as much a part of Stockton as its visible streets, buildings, and official narratives. By 1975, Stockton was a profoundly different city than it had been in the hopeful days of 1950. The initial post-World War II optimism had collided with numerous harsh realities over 25 years. Successive waves of migration had dramatically reshaped its demographics and its cultural landscape, bringing undeniable vibrancy and richness, but also new and complex social tensions. The port and the military bases continued to be important economic pillars, but the city's internal dynamics were increasingly defined by growing social inequality, a noticeable rise in crime rates, and the troubling emergence of powerful forces that would challenge its safety, cohesion, and fundamental identity for decades to follow. Stockton stood at a critical crossroads, its future path uncertain, its underground currents running strong, deep, and often turbulent beneath the surface of daily life. Birthing a sound of music along with the tragedies of the street life in the 70s, there was a musical edge to the city. Some youth was drawn to the street life while some turned to sports or music. Music groups of Stockton teenagers and young adults started to materialize. Groups formed like the Ninth Creation, a hometown funk band out of Stockton, and other bands started make a name for themselves. Music, sports, and street life is something we will discuss further later in our next episode. If you found this story meaningful, join the Choppin' Underscore game. _209 community. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends so more people can discover Stockton's untold history. We will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.